I met my husband when we were in college together. I was working on my bachelor's degree, helping out in the library for some needed extra cash. When I first laid eyes on him, he was not the usual sort of man I fancied, more bookish than muscly. I found him charming in his own way, and we struck up a friendship. He told me he was a writer, that he was working on a book of short stories to submit to a publishing house. I offered to read them, and from that moment on, I became his biggest fan. His stories were so visceral. He wrote not as a writer, but as a first-hand observer, and it wasn't long before his work was noticed. We were living together by then, our library friendship having blossomed into something more, and I could see how giddy he was when the letters came in from Bowding Publishing. When he read how they wanted to publish his book, I think it was the proudest moment of his life. He kept writing for Bowding, his stories finding a niche with the horror community. He also started selling his pieces to magazines and online sources, getting his name out there and becoming more recognizable. As his fame grew, however, he still jokingly called me his biggest fan. I couldn't argue with him. I genuinely loved his work. He wrote the sort of stories that were genuinely terrifying and enticed the reader to keep reading until the very end. As his stories grew in number, I found myself curious about where they all came from. My husband, we'll call him Michael, was a mild-mannered fellow who had never really experienced anything horrifying in his life. He described his childhood as benign, no broken bones or funny uncles. His family was loving and doted on him constantly. He had never been without. He had never really suffered, and I found myself very curious about where all these nightmares came from in such a beautiful mind. Then, over drinks one night, he told me. He didn't like to talk about, where he got the stories from, not when he was sober. He always said that discussing the creative process was boring, or that his story's technical aspects would bore me to tears. I wasn't fooled, though. Beneath his jokes was something colder, something fearful. So one night I pressed him. He still didn't really want to talk about it, but I persisted. Finally, after a lot of coaxing and some strong whiskey, he all but blurted his answer to me. I wish now that I hadn't asked. "It's the door," he said, and at that moment he seemed almost afraid of his own words. The door? I was confused by the queerness of his answer. What do you dream about? He asked the question so suddenly I was taken by surprise. Oh, I don't know. Normal things, I guess. What I did the day before, movies I've watched, weird things my mind cooks up. I've only ever had the same dream my entire life. It's always the same. It never changes. It's where I get all my ideas. I leaned forward, intrigued by what he was telling me. He seemed emboldened by my attention. The door lies in space. At least I believe it must be space. It floats in a great void, and every night I visit it. I float through this void naked, an umbilicus connecting me to whatever lies beyond. Every night I approach the door, and every night it whispers to me through the keyhole. Do you remember the little journal on my bedside? I nodded, begging him to go on with my eyes. I've trained myself to write the things I hear while sleeping. Sometimes I see pictures or faces when I look through the keyhole. Sometimes I hear terrible words spoken by creatures I imagine to be beyond my description. Sometimes I have to close my eyes and will myself awake because I'm afraid that the things they tell me will drive me insane. When I wake up, I read what I've written down, which becomes my stories. I was shocked. So all your stories come from this big door in space? He smiled at me. It sounds silly when you say it like that, but yes, everything I've ever written was spoken to me by something on the other side of that door. I didn't think anything of it the next day. We had been drunk, and he had just spouted off something to make me shut up. I was sure of it. I became more aware of his journal, though. Sometimes at night he would wake me up with the scritch-scratch of his pen on the page. I didn't like to look at him when he was writing it. It was like something otherworldly had taken his strings and was using him without his permission. Watching him write in that fugue state made me feel uncomfortable, and I took measures not to be awake while it was going on. I didn't think anything else of this, not until about 3 months ago. That was when he started having the nightmares. His work had always been creepy, always terrifying, but now it took on an alarming quality. He began talking about creatures that lived beyond the door. These creatures sounded more than a little Lovecraftian, and he was assured that their presence on Earth was an affront to the natural order. They came and went, their arrivals marked by some with great portents, and their battles had shaped history. The stories weren't the only thing that changed, though. He began to sleep poorly. His sleep had always been placid, peaceful, but now he thrashed and mumbled in his sleep. He whimpered in the night about the pale lady or the green man and the riotous red that surged like blood. The words he wrote in his journal were unreadable, a foreign language, but he sat and scribbled them, transcribed them every morning like a dutiful follower of some religion. He began to change. His eyes bore huge bags. He was jumpy and unsure of himself, and more than once I caught him catnapping fitfully during the day. His writing, however, was more in demand than ever. The magazines he wrote for wanted more stories about these strange old ones. His editor wanted to publish a compilation of them at once. He had no lack of material for the book, but I began to get worried about his health as he proceeded. We had been married for 2 years then, just starting to make a life together, and I was afraid that his candle would burn out before mine. I asked him one night to stop writing the stories. He was at his computer, typing away dutifully, when I made the request. He turned his head to look at me, haunted eyes boring into mine, and laughed for the first time in weeks. It wasn't his laugh, though. The laughter was jagged and full of despair, humor shared only by the damned. He laughed like a madman. I can't. If I stop writing, they won't like it. Who? I asked in confusion. The ones behind the door. They've marked me as their chronicler. I can't stop until the job is done. These things are killing you. Can't you see that, Michael? He slumped over his keyboard, resting his head against it, making a line of letters as he did so. Don't you think I would if I could? If I could stop, I would give so much to stop. The things they tell me, no one should have to know these things. It's fruit from the poison tree, and I wish I did not have the knowledge that they've given me. Then stop, I said suddenly. Just stop writing. Tell them you refuse to write their story. He looked horrified. Refuse them? I've never refused a story before. What if it stops the door from working? I turned him in his chair and pulled him to me. The door is in your mind, love. The way it manifests is nothing more than your own mind working through your stories. The monsters are of your own making. You control them. They don't control you. At that moment, he looked relieved. He hugged me back and seemed on the verge of tears. I don't think he had ever thought of those nightly excursions as anything but in a literal sense. He had never imagined that these things could be of his own creation, and the knowledge had made him feel free. I'll tell them tonight, then, he said with a smile on his face. I'll tell them that I don't want to write about them anymore. I'll tell Fred that I don't want to continue these stories in the morning. He won't like it, but he'll understand. He went to bed then, and I figured that would be the end of the nightmares. I was wrong. He woke me in the middle of the night, screaming. The back of his hands hit me in the face, and I rolled awake to the sound of him screaming. He was thrashing around, clutching his stomach and kicking his legs frantically. I tried to wake him. I know everything says not to do that, but I wanted him to wake up. I slapped his face. I threw water on him. I screamed his name, but nothing worked. Someone banged on the door, but I ignored them. I tried in every way I could to help my husband. Finally, he helped himself. We were in the ER. The knocking person had called the paramedics, and they had burst in. They thought someone was being murdered, but they loaded him up and took him straight to the hospital when they saw what was going on. He lay in an ER bed, screaming and kicking until they finally restrained him. He went right on thrashing and yelling until nearly 4 in the morning. Then he gasped loudly, like a diver coming up from a deep depth, and seemed to come awake. "They cut my umbilicus," he said in a tone of the most profound sorrow. They moved him upstairs later that day. The doctor who talked to him was afraid that he might hurt himself, and I was a little worried too. For the next 2 days, he sat strapped to a hospital bed, fighting sleep. He couldn't sleep, he told me, because he would have no way back without his umbilicus. I would be lost forever, and my consciousness would float forever in that void. He told me how he had told the thing behind the door that he would no longer write its story. I had assured him that it was all in his head, that it was a product of his imagination. When it had burst through the door and screamed, he knew it was all too real. He had run then, fled across the void, but the creature had wings and it had chased him. It defies description. Its legs were equine, its head like living rock. Its body was made of stars. I don't know, dear. Its mouth was full of fiery teeth, and when it lunged at me, I could do nothing but flee. As he had run, the thing had slashed at him. The clawed hand had torn at his umbilicus. Michael said a pain like a rending scythe had torn through his belly, and as he writhed, he could see the fiery teeth sever the root from him. He had caught the end then, using the last of his strength to grab the trailing end, and pulled himself out of the dark place, a little at a time. He was afraid after that, afraid to go back, afraid of what might be waiting there for him. He fought sleep for the next 3 days. He would nod and awaken, but it seemed harder for him to come back every time. He begged his doctor for caffeine pills, for coffee, for anything to keep him awake, but the doctors thought sleep would be the best drug for him. They fiddled with the idea of sedating him, but I forbade it. When they threatened to get the police involved, thinking I was somehow responsible for this, I threatened to call a lawyer. Finally, we reached a shaky standoff. It was moot after day 3. I lost the fight first, drifting off as I sat by his bedside. When I awoke, he was gone. He's in the ICU now. His coma is deep, and the doctors are afraid he might have suffered a stroke. They don't know about his nightly travels. Wouldn't believe me if I told them. But I know what's been happening to him. He's adrift in the void now, maybe already dead at the hands of this elder thing, and there's nothing I can do to get him back. But maybe there is something you all can do. My husband could not be the only one traveling to this place. Some of you must have heard the whispers through the door as well. If you see this door, and if you find my husband, please bring him back. I don't know how you would, but please try. And if the creatures on the other side of the door talk to you about things from the other side, please do yourself a favor and listen to them. Don't ever stop listening to them. I wish I had never told him to stop listening. The price you pay for ignoring them might be your life. The price might even be steeper than that. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Final Thoughts. Final Thoughts would like to give our listeners a 10% discount on their premium package. Wouldn't you like the peace of mind of hearing from your loved ones just one last time? Well, at Final Thoughts, they can... Mark spooled the volume down as he waited for the commercial to end and his podcast to pick back up. He glanced out the window and was greeted by another sign for Final Thoughts. The company was barely a year old, and already they were everywhere. He turned the podcast back up, but wasn't really paying attention anymore. The traffic moved sluggishly around him, like an artery clogged with plaque. He just knew that it would make him late for dinner, and then Lisa would be upset. She hated it when he was late for dinner. The words of the host were cut off suddenly, as his phone chirped and displayed Lisa's picture on the screen. Mark sighed. She was probably calling to ask when he'd be home. She wouldn't be happy when he told her he was going to be late. He'd worked late every day this week, and she had probably made a big surprise dinner for Friday. He considered ignoring it, but knew that would just lead to a bigger fight. He caught it on the 5th ring. "Hey, hun," he said, trying to sound chipper. "Hi, sweetie." Her voice put Mark on edge. They'd been married almost 7 years, and he'd learned how to read her reasonably well in the early parts of the relationship. Her voice was high, unnaturally sweet, and he could already tell that something was wrong. This was the voice she used when she was upset and trying not to show it. when she had bad news but didn't want to tell it. He almost thought he could hear her holding back tears, but didn't want to say so. "Lisa, is everything okay? How was your day? Did you make any big sales?" That took Mark aback. Lisa wasn't usually interested in his work. "Yeah, I made a few big sales. Mr. Copeland said I'm likely a shoo-in for Employee of the Month." That's fantastic, dear. I'm so proud of you." When she said it, there was a slight wince at the end of the word, and Mark could still swear that she was trying not to cry. She was acting strangely. What was going on over there? As Mark sat in bumper-to-bumper traffic, he couldn't help but imagine that someone with a gun was in his house, telling his wife to call him. Maybe someone had died, Mark thought, and she was trying not to tell him until he got home. As the car ahead moved, Mark took his foot off the brake and accelerated forward enough to stop again. Just up ahead, he could see a road worker holding a sign. This was the gatekeeper for a stretch of road laden with roadmen and trucks. This was the source of the traffic, and Mark cursed loudly, realizing that this would take the better part of an hour to get through. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Lisa asked, in that same overly chipper voice that verged on breaking. "Oh, it's road work, babe. Looks like I won't be home for dinner for at least an hour." She made a sound, and to Mark it sounded like a sob. "Oh, I'm sorry, hon. I was hoping you were a little closer. I had something I needed to tell you." Her words broke apart as she spoke, and Mark was getting kind of worried about what was going on at home. "Lisa, is something wrong? You sound like you're barely able to stop yourself from crying. What's going on?" "I promise you won't get mad. I don't want the last thing I hear to be the sound of you mad." Her words sent a chill through him. "The last thing you hear? What are you talking about?" She paused for a moment, seeming to choose her words carefully before continuing. "Mark, honey, there was an accident." "An accident? What happened?" A car beeped at him, and Mark jittered forward a little bit. He had expected to hear that someone had died, that dinner was burnt, maybe that there was a bill that had come in and it was really bad. He had thought maybe there was a home invader or a kidnapping plot. He had thought of 1,000 different things, but her being hurt was never one of them. Lisa rarely left the house. When she did, it was always to her destination and back again. Lisa's parents had been killed in a car accident about 10 years ago, and it had all but made her a shut-in. "I don't want to talk about it. Can't we just make our last conversation a happy one? I don't want you to remember me like this after I'm gone," she said, finally breaking down. Mark could hear her crying on the other end, and the sound was too much. When the car beeped at him this time, he ignored it. Mark had already stripped off his seatbelt and was climbing out of his vehicle. The driver blared his horn and yelled at him, but Mark didn't care. He was running up the sidewalk, phone pushed against his ear, as he ran for their apartment. His apartment wasn't far from the office, but he always drove because he didn't want to arrive with his suit smelling of sweat in the street. He had always considered the 30 minutes to an hour it took him to get home as his time. Now he just wanted to get home before his wife breathed her last. "What happened, dear? Just keep talking to me." Her voice was becoming weaker, but he craved it like a starving man wants a slice of bread. I was dusting the lights. I dust them every Friday. They get so dirty during the week. I was up on a stepladder, and I guess one of the brackets snapped. I fell and hit my head on the table. I saw the blood on the floor and knew it was bad. I'm sorry, Mark. I'm such a klutz." "Don't be sorry," he said as he ran up the street. People moved out of his way, or they were knocked aside. A woman fell on the curb, and her angry voice followed Mark as he ran. Mark passed a policeman, and the man tried to stop him. He juked around him and kept running. His apartment was only 3 blocks away, and he knew he could make it. "I'm scared, Mark." That gave him a burst of speed. Just hold on, I'm almost there," he huffed as he ran across the street, the sound of horns blaring behind him. I feel cold. "Please, stay with me, Lisa," he almost cried, tears dripping down his face onto the phone. He could see their apartment building as it loomed in the distance. The gray facade had never looked better to him, and he knew it was only a block away. He ran flat out, his suit coat billowing behind him, his button-up hanging long around his waist. He looked crazed, but he didn't care. He was going to see her. He was going to save her. He was going to be there for her. "Mark," she gasped. Her voice had become as fragile as glass. "I'm here, honey. There's an ambulance outside the complex, as well as several police cars. What's going on? Has someone called for help? Why didn't you say so? I just wanted to let you know my time's almost up." His breath hitched in. Don't talk like that. We'll have more time. I see paramedics outside. They must be here for you." "No, they've already come and got me, Mark." He stopped as he watched them roll out a gurney with a black bag on it. The bag was zipped up, the contents not moving. The paramedics loaded it into the back of an ambulance and closed the door. They rolled away without ever seeing Mark at all. "You're hearing my voice because I signed up for Final Thoughts. I know you don't like them, but I wanted you to have some closure if something ever happened to me. I remember how much it messed me up when my parents died, and I never got to say goodbye. I've only got about a minute left, Mark, but I want to tell you that I love you, and I'll always love you." Mark stood on the sidewalk as the cold numbness rushed over him. He was hearing her voice for the last time. She was already gone, already dead, and now he was listening to the last words she would ever say. This was grisly. It was a joke. How could they put a time limit on how long he could spend with his wife? "Mark," she whispered, her voice a thin edge of dandelion fluff. He swallowed his emotion. This was his wife's final moments. He didn't want them to be meaningless. I love you too, Lisa. I've always loved you." "Goodbye, Mark. I love you," she whispered. She sounded happy. The line went dead. Everything changed the day that Jarrett Ray killed himself. He had been a YouTube star, an internet darling, and his life had been a TV show since he picked up a guitar. The video of an 8-year-old Jarrett Ray learning his chords is still on his memorial channel. The sight of him playing beside his granddad, the old man smiling and cackling as the young boy devoured his lessons, is tear-jerking. People talk about how you could just tell so-and-so was happy because it was written all over their face. Well, it was true in this case. Bobby Ray, Jarrett's granddad, was truly happy when he watched his grandson play those first halting chords from the chair beside him. He'd tell Jarrett 10 years later, his hands and muscles withered from cancer, that teaching him to play had been the proudest moment of his life. Police have found another apparent suicide in Little Brine today. This brings the death toll into the thousands, with the numbers in the millions expected by the end of the day. I looked up from the tea I'd been making inside. All this because of some stupid tart who couldn't tell when she was supposed to be ashamed. I'd been watching the reports come in all day. After the video had gone viral, it was all anyone could do to keep up with the death toll. All this over a song. All this because someone wrote a song. But it was more than a song, wasn't it? He'd won his 5th grade talent show, his 6th grade, and 7th grade as well. By the time he was in 8th grade, the administration had simply let him close the show. Every year he wrote a new song, just for the occasion, and many of them made their way onto his albums after he'd been discovered. During the interview they did for the documentary, his classmates spoke about how he had left them in tears. They said there would never be anyone like Jarrett, and when Jarrett sang, it was like he was singing just for you, like he was the only other person on Earth. The numbers are only just starting now to solidify. 750,000 deaths worldwide, with another 5 million expected by the end of the day. This is a global crisis, and the numbers are just beginning to come together. Of the nearly 7.5 million people worldwide who watched the video, only those reported have been discovered dead, which begs the question, when will the others surface? I had to watch the news on my old TV set. I had turned off the router and the modem hours ago. I couldn't risk Sophia. I put the thought out of my head immediately. If she couldn't get on her tablet, she'd come out here. There would be no reason for her not to. She'd been home with a fever today, so she'd slept through most of the news reports. Some small part of me was glad I had managed to cloister her. If she had been at school when the video had went live, who knows? Jarrett had started his rise to fame as many did at the time. He recorded himself singing, playing the guitar, and posted it on YouTube. He was a moderate success, the people from his hometown pushing his numbers a little, but he never rose above a few thousand views. When they announced YouTube Talent, an invitation for YouTubers to send in their best and try to get discovered, he submitted his video and found the audience he'd been seeking. The adoration he'd found for his music at school was multiplied by 1 billion, and from there, the sky had been the limit for Jarrett. His music touched people, made them discover things they never knew they'd lost. I can remember fondly when one of his songs had come on the radio at work. For those 2 or 3 minutes as he sang, it was as if no one could have a bad day. No one could be anything less than fantastic and in a wonderful mood, and the world was just a little brighter while he was in it. He was our songbird, but we ultimately took him for granted. Deaths have reached a catastrophic level. 3 million people dead, and somehow the views just keep rising. The death toll is now expected to be somewhere around 250 million before the end, as people go to see what all the fuss is about. News outlets are begging viewers not to indulge their curiosity, as the video has been confirmed to have a nearly 100% death rate thus far. He had met Crystal while guest hosting Saturday Night Live. She had a track record for loving and leaving influencers, breaking their hearts and taking their money if they were dumb enough to marry her. She seemed to have her eyes set on Jarrett. Their love affair was one for the tabloids, a string of fights and makeups, and public declarations of love or anger. She wanted to be a musician, it seemed, and even her middling talent couldn't pull down his star. She appeared with him on several albums, came on stage with him at concerts, but at the end of the day, it was Jarrett they came to see, and she knew it, hated it. She was a 24-year-old time bomb who was about to destroy the world with her need for attention. When she left him after 5 years together, the world sighed with relief. They gasped, however, when she accused him of abuse. She had bruises, a very convincing black eye, and the ear of a tabloid writer who told her whole story in glaring prose and glossy pictures. She made the talk show circuit, telling about her harrowing experience and their toxic relationship. Eventually, Jarrett was called upon to defend himself in the court of public opinion. It was crap. He claimed she had left because she had ultimately gotten everything out of their relationship that she could, other than his name. He was tired of putting up with her tantrums and her public spectacles and was ready to move on with his life. Their relationship was not a sustainable one, and he was looking for more than someone to make bad press with. They had drifted apart, and it was time for them to move on to better things. He was reasonable and adult about the whole matter, but people didn't want reasonable, even with a media darling like Jarrett. She cried and pouted while he sat and reasonably explained, and the audience ate their daily dose of drama. We have reports of a group of students on the roof of a high school in Des Moines. Unresponsive to verbal commands, they are ignoring police as they... Oh God, they've jumped! As emergency services try to save who they can, we can see more students coming out of the emergency hatch and preparing to join their fellow students. His reputation was ruined. There was never any proof that he had or hadn't hurt Crystal, but she fashioned her story into a lucrative book deal and a successful music career. Jarrett, on the other hand, was damaged goods. He was unbookable, his sales plummeted, and his songs slowly stopped playing on the radio. It seemed that no one wanted to be seen supporting a suspected abuser, and his star had now begun to fall. The next 3 years would see him in and out of rehab, falling hard into drug use and depression, and when he came out, he went back to YouTube with something very different. Reports are coming in about a group of men who have set themselves on fire in Kaito. Their dying is quiet, dignified, and they burn without so much as a whimper, Kaito authorities say. When he returned, his music wasn't the same. The upbeat, happy songs full of hope were replaced with melancholy ballads full of despair and hopelessness. Someone sent me one of his songs in a YouTube link once, and I swear you could feel it sucking the air out of the room. He conveyed every ounce of his suffering in his song, and though his views were just as high as they had always been, no one talked about his music now. His music was a monster that was best left under the bed. No one wanted to listen, but their curiosity wouldn't let them look away. We have cell phone footage of 3 men jumping into a cave mouth in Arizona National Park. The cave, usually requiring climbers to rappel to reach the floor, is nearly a mile deep. Emergency services are still attempting to get the bodies, and 2 members of the EMS are said to have joined the jumpers upon their arrival. 2 days ago, Jarrett made his last YouTube video. He finished something haunting, halting, tears streaming down his cheeks as he poured his soul into every note. He played acoustically, and his guitar was not tuned. The jangling melody of his untuned strings were ethereal, almost industrial. As he played, it was like watching some dying animal limp through the forest towards the spot where it will drop. As he came to a close, his voice trailing off painfully, he turned to the camera and thanked the audience. He thanked them for their loyalty, for their time, for their support, and for everything they had shown him during these trying times. He informed his audience that this was the last time he'd be on YouTube, and wished them all a very happy life. Then he turned his camera off and walked away from life as anyone knew it. He killed himself in the bathtub that night. His mother found him with both wrists slit. Though she was horrified, she told someone that he died with the most serene look stretched across his face. Whatever he had been thinking about as he ended it all had given him such joy as he slipped off with it still in his mind. And so, Jarrett played his final song that night and passed into the annals of history. Well, that's not all he did, I suppose. The death toll swells to 3.5 million as medical services scramble to handle the influx of bodies. His death went mostly unremarked. A small service was held for him, and his body was interred in his hometown. A short squib about him went out on social media and on the news circuits. Outside of a handful of fans, though, everyone seemed to be comfortable just to forget about him. His death was sad, of course. The loss of someone so young and so talented is always sad. But people seem ready to move on and put all this behind them. And they would have if it hadn't been for Crystal and a voicemail that should have been private. She appeared on Snapchat one night, raccoon eyes and everything, to tell her fans about a voicemail she had received from Jarrett the night he had killed himself. I was at a charity event when he called, and I completely forgot about it until I saw it tonight in my missed calls. His voicemail lives on as his last words. He wanted me to give a gift, his last gift, and I think it's only right that I share his last moments with all of you. She held the phone up to the microphone, and from it spilled a monotone that no one had ever heard from Jarrett before. "Hello, Chris. I guess you're too busy to talk to me, so just listen. I've written you a song. Remember when I used to do that? It's just for you, so make sure you don't share it with anyone else. Something you can remember me by after I'm gone." She looked at the camera and sniffed a little as she smudged her raccoon eyes for effect. "I'll be playing that song live tomorrow night on Facebook. I haven't even heard it yet, but I just know that all of you will want to hear Jarrett's last song live at 8 p.m. on Facebook." True to her word, the very next night she played the song for everyone to hear. Police are again advising people to stay indoors. Close your windows. Do not open the doors unless emergency personnel call for you to do so. There is a fear that others might be weaponizing this phenomenon. The song was nothing like anything we had ever heard before. He had left her 2 messages, it would seem, and the second was a dirge sung a cappella. It was deep and halting, his voice spilling all the angst and pain he'd been keeping inside for 3 years. He bled his words for her, and the nearly 20,000 people who watched, and in the end, he simply hung up and was ended forever. Crystal cried, of course, and talked about how important he was to her, despite how things had ended. She wished that their relationship could have gone on indefinitely, wished they could have spent their lives together, and thanked her fans for experiencing this moment with her. 2 days later, she was dead. Someone has thrown a Molotov cocktail through the doors of the YouTube corporate office. The platform claims to be blameless in all this, but its failure to act in regards to the video's takedown leads others to question its negligence. The next 2 days were awash with odd Facebook posts and strange Snapchat stories from Crystal. She claimed there were people in her house. She did a walking tour of her house in which she shouted at things only she could hear and brandished a knife. She told her fans that she thought Jarrett's ghost was haunting her, trying to get her to kill herself. She had a 2-hour video of nothing but her crying on the floor of her closet as she sobbed that people were outside the door, saying she should drown herself in her swimming pool. It all came to a head on the second day when she posted her final video. At 11:30 p.m., a staggering and slurring Crystal posted one last video to Snapchat. I found these pills in my medicine cabinet. They helped a little, but I can still hear his voice. He's telling me how this is my punishment, how I deserve to die. And you know what? He's right. I ruined Jarrett's career. He never hurt me. I just couldn't stand the idea that he could keep living and loving and being loved by people after I left. I'm a heartless bitch, and I deserve this. They found her in her pool the next day. She was the first casualty, but not the last. Mass panic in Singapore. People take to the streets, looking for their loved ones as the death toll. I heard the door to the back room open as Sophia wandered into the living room. She looked very childlike for a girl of 14, and I was glad for her. Let her be innocent a while longer. She would have to grow up soon enough. She lay her head on my lap, watching the TV with a sense of dread as she took in what was going on. She didn't ask me about her phone. I had slipped in and taken both her phone and her tablet while she was asleep. She only laid her head against my lap and watched the news talk about the deaths in China and the deaths in Russia and the deaths right here in our own hometown. As we watched, I continued to listen as a story that only I could hear played over and over again in my head. He had learned to play the guitar at 8 years old. His grandfather had died of cancer. He was a local celebrity by the time he was 12. Crystal had ruined his life. It was an endless on and on and on. I'd been trying to block it out for the better part of 6 hours, but it just kept going no matter what I did. Someone had posted the video of Crystal's live stream to YouTube shortly before her death. As of this very second, 600 million people had heard what the media was calling Jarrets Dirge, and I was one of those people. Even as the first reports were coming out, I listened to the song via a Facebook link from my sister Pam. Pam had sent me a text an hour ago saying her farewells and wishing me luck. The voices had been rising in frequency, increasing in volume with every repetition. As I stroked my daughter's hair, I began to wonder how long I would last. "He learned to play at 8, you know," she said, and the words sent a chill up my spine. "What?" I asked, looking down at Sophia as she lay watching the steadily increasing death toll. His grandfather taught him to play the guitar at 8 years old. He told him on his deathbed that it was the proudest moment of his life. "Mom, I'm scared. How long is this going to last?" My stroking hands felt clammy as they slid over her straight hair, and as she waited, I realized that I had no answer for her. We were two amongst millions, and we would see how long it took before the dirge had us as well. Hey there, folks. Dr. Plague here. Hope you're having a good night. This is just me popping in at the beginning to let you know that the nature of this video is a little triggering to certain people. It involves animal violence, animal cruelty, and things of a sexual nature, such as fetishes and adult activities. If that's something that you're not wanting to hear, then, go find another video. Maybe one of my other videos. I don't know. Can't tell you how to live your life. But if this is right up your alley, then please enjoy. I was speechless when she sent me the message. Even her text looked sexy in the pink curly writing she used. It was short and sweet and to the point, but it still filled my chest with a tightness that wouldn't go away. At the time, it was a dream come true. Meet me at the Hotel Aries at 11 p.m. Don't be late. I couldn't believe this was happening. Tonight, I would meet with Lady Dragora. I guess you could say I have a slight problem with weird fetishes. I discovered pornography when I was young, like most people I know. I was 12, I was horny, and someone I knew said I could find boobs online if I looked. I dived headfirst into a well I don't think I really understood the depths of. It started with generic stuff, naked photos, short clips from films, and led to my current level of kink. I started slow, it was the 90s after all, and internet connections were not what they would become. I have waited all day for a single picture to load, only to be disappointed when the phone rang and everything was lost. Most of my early burgeonings were done in chat rooms, in the steamy squares of private messages. With both of my parents away at work, I was on the computer every day after school. I didn't discover my proclivity for vor until I was in college. When you've been cruising the web for as long as I have, you eventually find yourself into some offbeat stuff. You can't experience that much depravity and not be changed fundamentally, and I was no different. I had recently grown bored with my selection of smut and went looking for something different. When I found vor, though, I knew I had found something special. Vor, if you're unfamiliar, is a fetish that centers around eating or being eaten by something. In the community of niche communities, vor is pretty niche. I belong to several online communities where we discuss the acts and the aftermath and trade images online. But I only know a few people in my area who are into it. We meet up once a week to have coffee and gush over our favorite vor videos and whatnot, and gush over our local legend, Lady Dragora. Lady Dragora was a legend in the vor scene. She had a subreddit devoted to her videos, a Snapchat full of fans who hungered for her next performance, and a legion of fans willing to pay exorbitant fees for her live shows and recordings. She wouldn't tell people her age, but most of us guess she's in her 30s. She has this long, dark hair that falls in straight waves of ebony silk, and her eyes hold the slight hint of some Asian parentage, maybe. She's beautiful, she's exotic, and she was a total sadist. Lady Dragora made the kind of videos that were illegal everywhere. She made the sort of videos that came with a price tag payable in cryptocurrency. I had seen other so-called vor videos before her, but many were obviously fake, obviously staged, or obviously CGI. People would eat mice only to have a jump cut before they started chewing. They would dangle CGI mice over their gaping maws. They would pretend to eat things or eat things they were pretending were alive. And after a while, it just becomes a little old. Her videos were something different. The first video I ever saw involved her eating a rat the size of her hand. The video opened on a terrarium full of squirming rats, not mice, sewer rats. And as she approached the tank, they all began to go wild. They ran over the top of each other, squealing in pure terror. It was as though they sensed a bigger predator coming and wanted to be sure her eyes didn't fall on them. She was dressed in what would become her signature black bodice, garters, black choker, black elbow-length gloves, and long leather knee-high boots. Some videos seemed to require music laid over the top, but not hers. When she reached inside the tank, you could hear the rats screaming and flailing inside as they tried desperately to avoid her hand. She selected one of them and pulled him out with a gloved hand. The rat squirmed and kicked, visibly distressed by her, but she paid him no mind. She replaced the lid and walked away from the tank with the screaming rodent. Their cries were high-pitched, almost pig-like, and you could hear them off camera in low waves. The video cut to her, holding the rat up to the camera, still squirming and biting as it struggled to free itself. She held it too tight in her clenched fist, and its fur seemed to boil around that fist like water overflowing a glass. I expected a jump cut when she opened her mouth and leaned over the rat's head. It screamed pitifully as her teeth encircled its writhing head. He bit at her, lashing out with those sharp teeth, but if she felt it, she seemed not to notice. It spasmed as her teeth began to close around its head, and I watched, thinking to myself that the jump cut would be any minute now. This will be when the video jags and her teeth will close around a plastic rat. She'll be just another pretender, just another charlatan, just another... The blood flowed out as the rat made its final scream. Her teeth sank into it and tore at its skin. When she came away, she was chewing. chewing, and the rat's body twitched in her hand as she ate. The twitching stopped before she went back for another bite, but the blood made a macabre sort of fountain as it ran down her gloved fingers and pattered to the floor. She ate the whole rat, one bite at a time, bones and all, and as the tail disappeared down her throat, I was hooked. I'd probably watched about a dozen of her videos before I dared to show anyone. Sometimes she bit, which was hot, but sometimes it seemed that she would just swallow whatever she was eating whole. She'd worry it down with very little difficulty, her throat bulging as whatever it was slid down, and to me, that was more erotic than the chewing. It wasn't just rodents either. Eels, mice, more rats, chicks, they all went down her throat, while my friends and I paid $79.99 a video. 2 months ago, she put a small camera on a mouse and swallowed it whole while videoing its descent into her stomach. The camera must have cost her quite a bit. Between the size of the camera, the night vision interface, and the video's price, I knew it wouldn't be something we could expect often. The footage changed the way I'd viewed my fetish. Watching something struggle in her stomach, watching its final moments, was far more intimate than watching her swallow it whole. I told her as much on the comment section of her website. I spilled my guts to her, hoping to impress her, and somehow it worked. I wish I knew what would come of that stupid comment. I was shocked when she responded. I'd been sitting at the coffee bar with the other members of our group, Doug and Matt and David. We were all discussing the latest video by Lady D when my phone chirped loudly. I looked down to check it and saw a banner informing me that Lady Dragora has responded to your comment. I almost spewed hot coffee on Doug before opening the message and reading what she'd written. The guys leaned in close, wondering what I'd seen to garner such attention, and when he saw the sender, he too almost spit coffee in surprise. I opened her message, and it said 8 short words. How profound. I would love to chat sometime. Dave whistled through his teeth. Wow, she rarely talks to fans. You're in, man. And so I was. As they sat crowded around me, I answered her, and she immediately began our strange correspondence. I didn't question it at the time, but the speed with which she picked up our conversations should have triggered a red flag or two. It was as though she were just waiting for me to respond, waiting for her prey to wander into her field of influence so she could snap the trap shut and watch it squirm. For 3 months, we chatted almost every day. We talked about everything: music, food, the usual getting to know you stuff. We eventually made it to topics that were a little more personal. It turned out that she held some strange beliefs about life force, believed that consuming the flesh of living creatures would give her their life force and extend her own life somehow. I asked her if she'd ever eaten human flesh, but she just joked that maybe I'd find out someday and danced around the subject. The more I talked to her, the more I became certain that she had traveled much and knew things that I could only guess at. She spoke about distant places and strange customs. If I hadn't been so enchanted by the attention of a celebrity, I might have seen the numerous red flags she was putting up. She talked a lot about places you didn't see on the Travel Channel, sites that didn't have names you could scroll across a map, locations both ancient and remote. A month ago, she asked me if I would roleplay with her. I agreed, of course, because I was hooked on her attention. Even in my haze of glamour, though, I knew there was something a little off. Her persona was that of a large reptile, and mine was always of some prey animal fit only for ingestion. She would describe my end, my passing between large and ancient lips, and my slow descent towards the transition into nutrition. I would describe my struggles, my vain attempts at escape, but she would always catch me and describe in loving detail my demise at her jaws. I loved it. After all, this was my thing, and I often walked away from our sessions with a bounce in my step. People probably had a hard time understanding how someone achieved satisfaction at the idea of being devoured, but to me, it was no different than any other obsession. We would roleplay twice a week, her scenarios and story threads becoming darker as they went, and before long, she wasn't just swallowing me whole, but tearing into me and getting a little violent. I was less on board with these instances. Imagining myself going through these pains were never my thing, but she always smoothed it over with personalized videos or custom works just for me. She made me feel special, made me feel accepted, and that's what made it easy to draw me in. This was also when I was approached by Justin. His screen name was Furrylocks on the board in question. Until he messaged me, I'd never even heard of him, though it seemed we moved in similar circles. My only correspondence with him was a message left in my inbox one morning. It was hastily written, full of spelling errors, and intrigued me to no end. I read it twice before class, and when I showed it to my friends in the Vor group, they brushed it off as a jealous fan. His message was not long, but it did make me question some rumors I'd heard on some of the other boards. It read, "You don't know me. My name is Justin. I understand that you've become close with an internet personality known as Lady Dragora. I don't know how much you know about her, but she may or may not be 100% what she seems to be. I had a friend whom I'd known since grade school. He caught the attention of the lady, and it was the happiest I'd ever seen him. Their relationship was brief, a month or two. Then one night, he told me she'd invited him to her hotel room. I didn't think anything of it until he didn't respond to my calls or texts for 2 days. He's been missing for 3 months now, and your new lady friend has either blocked me or refused to respond to any of my messages. I'm not trying to turn you away from your current relationship, whatever that might entail. I'm simply trying to warn you to be on your guard." I was hesitant to respond. It seemed better to just ignore him, but after a particularly grisly RP session a week later, I decided to message him and get some information. I was still very much under her spell, but some of our conversations had made me wary. After all, she was still a stranger on the internet. Growing up at an age of stranger danger, I was very wary of people online pretending to be someone they weren't, a collection of online videos or not. However, my message was never opened, never read, and when the invitation to her hotel room came across my box, I decided to put my fears aside and go for it. That's how I came to be in her hotel room at 11 p.m. She sent me the text around 6 in the afternoon. "Meet me at the Hotel Aries at 11 p.m. Don't be late," was all it said, but it was enough to get my blood running hot. The Hotel Aries was not a huge hotel, but it was one of the largest in this part of Chicago. The borough of Chicago was an hour from campus, but I drove the distance gladly. If she told me to drive to New York that night, I'd have done it. And with the invitation being so close to home, I decided I would be a fool not to accept. I told my friends from the coffee shop where I was going. They told me to take some video and let me know when they got home. I set out for the hotel in high spirits, my mind flooded with possibilities. I had arrived early, 2 hours early, hoping that maybe we could have a meal before whatever was going to happen tonight. I inquired at the front desk, and the man behind the counter gave me a knowing little smile as he slid the key card across to me. "She's gone out for a little while, but she mentioned that she likely had a guest coming tonight." "Have fun," he said. I started up to the elevator, wondering how often he'd had to do this for her. How often did she have guests? I took the elevator up to the penthouse and found a lavish one-bedroom suite decked out in rich fabrics and expensive furniture. I recognized it as the backdrop for many of her videos and found a camera already set up in the corner. She had left me a note, too, telling me to make myself at home and that she would be back at 11. The waiting was nerve-wracking. I took a seat on her luxurious couch and just sat there. My mind raced, going over possibilities and scenarios and making me a nervous wreck of anticipation. When the elevator finally came up to the penthouse, I felt a surge of excitement that my patience might finally pay off. She was framed in the elevator door as they opened, and it was the first time I'd ever met her in person. She wore a long tan coat and the same black boots she'd worn in her videos. Her shiny black hair was pulled back into its accustomed tail. As she stepped off the elevator, she let her coat puddle on the floor, and I could see her familiar black corset. She smiled when she saw me, and as I rose to greet her, she held out a finger, indicating me to stand and be quiet. She circled me, drinking me in with her eyes. The hungry way she looked at me made me both incredibly aroused and extremely uncomfortable. She was looking at me the way I look at a particularly tasty meal. Though this was certainly what I wanted, I had never seen someone look at another person that way before. She didn't say a word, just walked over to the camera and pointed it towards me. As she turned, I saw the red light was on. Looked like I was going to be in one of her movies tonight. "Don't worry," she said, her voice hinting at foreign places and exotic locales. "This is just for me. I'd never post anything online without your consent." I smiled at her and started to disrobe, but she stopped me with a delicate finger. "Leave them on. I like to handle the clothes myself." She stepped away from me then, eyes smoldering as she held me in her gaze, and then something happened. If you've ever seen one of those old werewolf movies, the kind where their whole body shifts in a rapid and sudden transformation, then you may have some idea of what I saw. If not, I'll try to explain it as best I can. Her body seemed to ripple, her whole form shuddering like an image in a pond, and suddenly there was something else in front of me. Her body was a long mass of jade scales towering 12 feet high. As it reached its full height, it had to crouch to avoid hitting the ceiling, but this seemed to suit it just fine. It crouched to eye level, its spade-shaped head hovering inches from my body, and I realized that its eyes, those vast and hovering pools of death, were the same as hers. I was trapped by those eyes, like a bird before the snake, and when she struck, I never even had a chance to run. If you're reading this, then your next question must be, how am I even writing this? Being eaten is normally where the story like this would end, but unfortunately for me, it's not. Lady Dragora, that queen serpent of myth, has been dining on humans for a very long time, it would seem. She neither bit nor tore me. Instead, she struck with a precision born of years of practice and swallowed me whole with little effort. As I slid down her throat, I felt the slimy walls caress me and the suffocating darkness inviting me towards terror. She had let me keep my phone, however, and as I wiggled to get it, I could feel a new sensation coursing through the giant muscles that were her body, the squirming desire for more. That's when I realized what she wanted. She doesn't want a quick meal. She doesn't want a satisfying feed. She wants a terrified body to thrash and scream as her body does what it does best. She wants my last few hours to be her pleasure. So I've been sitting as still as I can for the last hour of my life, writing this message to the outside world. I've sent a copy to my friends at the coffee shop, a copy to the Chicago police, and I've posted a copy here, hoping that someone will read this and take it seriously. I now know what happened to Justin's missing friend, what likely happened to Justin himself, and the fate that awaits me at the end of my life. I want my death to be the last, though, so if you read this and you see her, don't fall for her games. Don't let yourself be another meal for Lady Dragora. I don't know if anyone's going to read this. I don't even know if anyone will care. But I have to tell somebody. It's too much to process right now, and maybe if I get some of it off my chest, it will make it easier to handle. I'm getting ready to go into the unknown, and I feel like someone needs to know why. Someone needs to know how it came to all this, and how I came to be a potential murderer / avenging angel. Above all else, I need to tell someone about Charlie. I'd known Charlie since we were in grade school together. Charlie thought of us as brothers, since he didn't have any of his own, and loved us like family. Despite that, never think we were the most important people in Charlie's life. No, the most important person in Charlie's life was his grandmother. Charlie's grandmother, he'd always called her Grandmom, was the one who raised Charlie since the day he was born. Charlie's mother died in childbirth, and his father died before he was even born, so without a guardian, that just left Charlie and his grandmom. Grandmom and Charlie. Charlie's grandmom lived out in the country, in an old wooden farmhouse with a big backyard and acres of fields for growing things. She rented the land to sharecroppers and must have done pretty well for herself because Charlie couldn't recall a time she'd ever had to work. Charlie didn't have any other family, none that he'd ever met anyway, and for the first 8 years of his life it was just the two of them alone in that farmhouse. Charlie said he remembered being sick a lot as a kid, and most of his earlier memories were he and his grandmom on the couch while she nursed him back to health from one illness or another. Grandmom would sit at home with him while he convalesced, watching Sesame Street and eating whatever Grandmom could whip up in the kitchen. Most days, Charlie would just spend the whole day on her lap while she rocked him and hummed strange little Russian songs to him. Grandmom wasn't originally from here, you see. She had emigrated during the Second Great War, and she and his grandfather had moved out to the country because it reminded her of her childhood home. Coming from the old country, she had all kinds of folk remedies, good-tasting recipes, and strange little songs that she would sing to Charlie as he drifted off to sleep or lay sick on the couch. One in particular that Charlie recalled fondly had become a ritual of sorts, a ritual that goes on to this day, I assume, that took on the normalcy of time and repetition. She would take him on her lap, pull his face close to hers, and place her hands on his cheeks as she put their foreheads together. Charlie recalled the bumpy, veiny skin there beneath his smooth baby skin as she did this, and the warmth that always seemed to radiate from her. With their foreheads pressed together, she would sing a strange song to him in her thick Russian tone before releasing him and planting a kiss on his forehead. "What does it mean, Grandmom?" Charlie would always ask, and the asking was as much a part of the ritual as the ritual itself. "It means," she would say in her warm, gravelly voice, "always together, even when apart, always a part of me, here in my heart." Charlie had never thought it was odd that he lived in relative isolation with his grandmother, not until he started school. His grandmom had tried to homeschool him for a few years, but her teaching wasn't up to the state standards, so she had grudgingly allowed Charlie to attend public school. Here Charlie came into contact with other children, and first learned how strange his situation was. In class, we would do assignments or draw pictures of our family, and Charlie's was always the smallest when put up on the bulletin board with the rest. Charlie began to wonder why he didn't have any uncles or aunts or cousins, or any family besides Grandmom. When he asked her, though, she always shrugged and gave him the same answer. "Your grandfather and I had the one child. Your father was not a strong boy. He was sick, often like you are, and we were afraid to have another. By the time he was old enough to over his sickness, your grandfather was dead, and it was only me and your father." That made Charlie feel a little better. His father had been like him in that sense, sickly and alone with his grandmom, so it couldn't be that strange. That didn't stop the other kids from teasing him, though. I remember Charlie when he first arrived at school, and the other kids had him pegged as an oddball from the get-go. Going to school in the early 90s, it was all about how cool you were, how many cool things you had on your clothes. Charlie showed up the first day of school looking like the boy from the hot chocolate box my mom always bought. He wore suspenders and stockings, knee boots, and shirts with weird fringes on them. He stuck out like a sore thumb. This, mixed with his funny way of talking and his stunted knowledge base, made the other kids think he was slow and kind of a dweeb. He came in for quite a bit of ridicule, and I recall it was a hard couple of days before my friends and I got involved. This is where I come into Charlie's story, I guess. I had never taken part in the teasing, and over time I began to feel bad for him. I pushed some of my friends to invite him to play with us, and we were surprised to find not a dumb kid, but an imaginative kid, who joined in our games eagerly. His grandmom, had taught him a little Russian, which we thought was just the coolest, and we gave him some of our old clothes to wear so he didn't stand out quite so much. Together, we played G.I. Joes or superheroes or whatever the game of the day happened to be, and outside of play, we helped Charlie stand up for himself and make the bullies stop. As we got older, Charlie stayed at our place a lot, and we really helped him come out of his shell and adapt to life outside of Grandmom's house. We were friends with Charlie all the way through high school, and after high school, we all thought we might get an apartment together. Zach, Tristan, Charlie, and I, so we could attend college together. Charlie was hesitant. He didn't want to leave his poor old grandmom alone in the middle of the woods. So when he turned up at the house a few days later with a scant few possessions, I was pretty surprised. He had 2 plastic bags of clothes, a zipper bag of toiletries. After some coaxing, he told me he and his grandmom had had a really nasty fight. This surprised me, because I'd never heard of Charlie's grandmom ever raising her voice to him in all the time I'd known him. And he seemed just as shocked about the outburst as we were. She had refused to give him any of his stuff, except what he'd brought with him, and told him not to expect her to send him money or anything else. If he moved out now, he was on his own. You could tell how upset he was, poor guy, and we helped him out as best we could. He ended up sleeping on my couch until his first Pell check came in, and after that, he just kinda made do. I had expected that would be the end of his closeness with his grandma, but I couldn't have been more wrong. After a few weeks of silence, she went back to calling him every day, and to our astonishment, he made plans to have dinner with her and help her with her shopping. She would send him money sometimes, and he would go over several days a week to eat dinner or lunch, and slowly things began to return to normal. She still wouldn't let him take any of his stuff out of her house, but he got some new stuff, and by the time his first semester was done, he had everything that he needed. Things went on in this way for about 3 years, at least until last Wednesday. Charlie and I had just got back from class when he got a call from his grandma. His face fell as they talked, and you could tell that Charlie was barely holding back tears. She hadn't been doing well for several years, nearly from the time Charlie moved out, and I personally thought it was a guilt trip to keep her grandson close to home, though I'd never say as much to Charlie. He talked to her for a few minutes and then immediately went to his room and packed an overnight bag. He told me to tell his counselor that he had a family emergency and needed to go home to be with his grandmother. When I asked him what was going on, he told me that she was dying and she wanted him to stay with her until she passed. I commiserated with him and told him to give her my best and to stay in contact so we knew when he'd be back. That was a week ago, and it was the last time anyone has ever seen or heard from Charlie. His car is gone, his things are gone from his room, and Charlie has disappeared without a trace. I drove the hour to his grandmother's house, hoping to find some clues when I got there, only to be greeted by a stranger when the door opened. She was a tall, dark-haired woman with lank hair and a swollen, pregnant belly, and she was no one I had ever seen before. Yeah, hell, Charlie and his grandmom were the only two people I'd ever seen at the house before now. She claimed to be a distant relative that had inherited the house from Charlie's grandmother when she died. She didn't seem to speak English very well, and was completely unsure as to who Charlie was or where he had gone to. We quickly lost patience with each other, and she yelled at me to leave before she called the authorities. I seethed all the way home, but I couldn't get any answers out of her. I got my answers last night. It was around 2 a.m. in the morning when something woke me up from a deep sleep. My legs were full of pins and felt like someone was sitting on them. I rolled over, thinking one of my roommates had wandered in drunk, only to find Charlie sitting on my bed. Even in the dim light, I could tell something was wrong. Charlie looked bad, withered somehow, like a grape that gets left in the crisper drawer for too long. Or a corpse after it's dried out in a grave. He spoke to me, his voice a rattling rasp in my ears, and told me that something had happened. He'd gone to be with his grandmom. He found her on her deathbed, and she'd reached for him with her withered arms when he'd come in. He'd slumped, weeping by her bedside, and she'd reached out with her wrinkled hands and touched his face. He looked at her, and she had asked him to put his forehead against hers, so she could say the words one last time. She was my grandmom, and I loved her. How could I deny her anything? He said, his voice racked with pain. So he let her draw his face to hers, and she said the old familiar words as she always had. Always together, even when apart. Always a part of me, here in my heart. But when she kissed him on the forehead, his lips already starting to ask what it meant, he felt something strange. It was like she was taking everything from me. My breath, my blood, my bones, my seed, and all with that single kiss on my forehead. As she had taken all of it from him, he had crumpled up into a dried husk as she changed before his eyes. Her hair darkened, her skin tightened, her eyes sparkled, and he said that her belly had grown large even as her breasts grew heavy with milk. When she stood over him, she was 50 years younger, a girl of 20, and I realized that she was the woman who had opened the door for me. She stood over him, cackling at his desiccated form, and her face was devoid of the love that had always been there. Now you'll see why I have kept you close all these years. Now you'll see the fruit of my labor, just as your father did before you and your grandfather before him, she said, looking down at Charlie without pity or remorse. Why? He asked huskily, his voice dry as a desert. Why have you done this? Why? This is the state that befalls all your line. Males for centuries and centuries. Males from the first of your name to crawl upon this earth. He told me I was ugly.
He spat on my love, and he promised me that I would never have him. I promised him that I would have all of his line, bear them and break them. So I have from that time on. Your son, she said and gave her belly a little stroke, will be no different. And as she stood cackling over him, Charlie died and passed into the void that waits beyond. He told me all of this as I sat huddled by the head of my bed, but promised me that she was wrong. She would have no more from his line. The cycle would end with his son. He told me some things he understood now, and called his grandmother a Vedma, which is the Russian word for witch. He also called her a Strigoi, but he hopes he's wrong about that. A mortal man may kill a Vedma if he is very lucky, he told me, but a Strigoi is another matter entirely. He made me promise if I ever called him friend, to rescue my son and kill his grandmom, once and for all. It will be dark soon, and he says that tonight will be the night of her delivery, which will make her weak. I'm leaving this here just in case I don't come back, in case someone out there might save Charlie's son if I fail. I have the things I need, and midnight will be here before I know it. I hope I'm strong enough to do what must be done. I pray I don't come to my friends in the night with a similar request. I pray that I can break this curse and make Charlie its last victim.